So to satisfy them, it was agreed that the word disorder in DSM-3 would be followed in parentheses by the word neurosis. This group, though small in number, were always unhappy with DSM-3 and 4, and finally about 4 years ago they brought out their own diagnostic manual. It's called the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual. To give you a sense of how it differs from DSM-4, let's say on the diagnosis of anxiety, it says that an anxiety disorder can be traced to 4 basic danger situations. Loss of a significant other, loss of love, loss of body integrity and fear of damage to one's genital organs, and loss of affinity to one's conscience. Now that is exactly what Sigmund Freud wrote in 1926. Or have we progressed any further in 100 years? Look it up. It's on page 98. I submit to you that the DSM-4 approach to anxiety is far superior, and that a return to such vagueness will further marginalize the mental health field. If it is suggested that counselors should ignore the DSM-4, they too will be marginalized in the job market. This is a current too strong to swim against. The human experience is complex, and each person's subjective experience of life is uniquely theirs. Optimal and compromised functioning is a complex matter. Yet, when a person's experience is one of unremitting depression and despair, we need to have a language to describe it. A language that communicates clearly and has commonly agreed upon definitions. DSM-4 offers precisely that kind of language. And like all living languages, it evolves and becomes crystallized over time. Nothing that has been suggested so far comes remotely close to the usefulness of DSM-4 for everyday clinical practice. But DSM-4 is far from a perfect document. Yet it has most practical and valuable usefulness because it helps clinicians clarify the disorder that a client is experiencing, and also points to treatment considerations when assessing and alleviating the distress of a client. Its multi-axial design provides a broad clinical picture of the client. When used properly, it not only provides Axis 1 and Axis 2 diagnosis, but adds the physical health issues as well as the psychosocial stressors that are present in the client's life. And finally, it asks the clinician to assess the global functioning of the client, giving all the problems that exist in their life. This multi-axial design has improved the reliability of diagnosis among clinicians. It brings uniformity of language to the mental health community and improves treatment outcomes by keeping clinicians focused on exactly what needs to be improved. Now, the word diagnosis itself comes from 2 Greek words, diagnosis, which literally means by knowledge. Several in the anti-psychiatry movement believe with Foucault that concepts like sanity and insanity are actually social constructs and reflect somehow the power of the sane over the insane, to use his terminology. To some degree, Foucault has a point in that culture plays a role in what is considered normal and abnormal. For instance, the Chinese Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is quite similar to the DSM-4, has a few culturally bound conditions. They list an interesting condition called GRS, genital retraction syndrome, whereby the client fears the disappearance of his genitalia into his body. A bit like a turtle's head receding under the shell. There is no recorded evidence in the literature of this ever occurring. Yet it does not stop the Chinese from listing it as a disorder. However, it is roughly similar to an anxiety disorder that we have in DSM-4. Thus, we can point to some culturally bound conditions described in DSM-4, and although they are few in number and are of minimal significance in clinical practice, they do exist. Indeed, they could profitably be deleted from the DSM-4, point, I'm sure, which my opponent will underline. But on balance, the objective criteria sets delineate clinical disorders in ways that are useful. Categorical distinctions in DSM-4 are possible because disorders have similar key symptoms, similar natural history, prognosis, and complications. For example, clients experiencing dementia have similar symptoms, similar natural history, prognosis, and complications. It is a valid and reliable diagnosis. Now, some may ask why we need classifications at all. In the real world of clinical practice, where services are provided by a variety of professional specialties and paid for by third-party payers, it is imperative that we can describe accurately what we are treating and how it is being treated. Long ago, payers have grown tired of vagueness and the use of unclear language regarding diagnosis and treatment, in part because of the abuses of the past. We have managed care today. In my view, treatment is better today than ever in our history, precisely because we are more accurate in our diagnosis and we are capable of developing crisp treatment plans. The so-called constructivists seem to think that we cannot establish objective criteria because there is no ontological reality. Constructivists claim that all knowledge is necessarily a product of our own cognitive acts, and that in fact there is no objective reality. We construct our own reality out of our own experience. Therefore, as experience changes, reality changes. That means that the notion of diagnosis, which is by knowledge, is an impossible task. Their philosophic approach relegates them to the sidelines of this debate, reduced to chanting, "You're wrong," or "You can't say that." Yet they are unable to offer a more clinically useful alternative. The epistemology of constructivism, it seems to me, can be reduced to whatever you think yourself. This constructivist approach leads them to a cloud of vagueness where nothing is clear. So often the subjective experience of a client is one of confusion, depression, anxiety. In that context, an epistemology of vagueness and uncertainty is both unappealing and unhelpful. Imagine a case conference with a group of postmodern constructivists engaging in interesting but useless theorizing in a fog of uncertainty. Another source of criticism of DSM-4 comes from a couple of other extremist thinkers. Dr. Christina Summers, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank that advised and guided President Bush and Vice President Cheney. Well, her book, published in 2005, is entitled "One Nation Under Therapy." And if you read it, you will get a glimpse of her views. She claims that much of what is in DSM-4 used to be considered either normal or a sin. And now it is given a diagnosis and provides jobs from, quote, unneeded therapists. A couple of years ago, she gave testimony at a Senate subcommittee in Washington on Veterans Affairs. The topic was PTSD, where she said, quote, "PTSD is very, very rare among our troops in Iraq." And appropriating funding for such treatment is, quote, "a waste and unnecessary." Thankfully, the Senate ignored her input. To be manifestly incorrect is one thing, but to undercut treatment for our troops is offensive. The oldest critic of the DSM-4 is the mercurial Dr. Thomas Szasz. A look into his worldview is as revealing as that of Dr. Summers. He is a scholar at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank that fundamentally believes that restrictions of our freedoms, any kind, must be challenged. He claims that both mental illness and psychotherapy are both myths. This venerable physician is a member of an organization called FORCES, an acronym for Fight Ordinances and Restrictions to Control and Eliminate Smoking. Now, any physician that is part of such a movement insisting that we should be allowed to smoke without restriction is surely going to oppose the DSM-4. Other civil libertarians tend to be suspicious of what Szasz calls the therapeutic state, in which disapproved thoughts, emotions, and actions are repressed through pseudo-medical interventions. More recent libertarian thinkers object to what they call the medicalization of social phenomena,